of us have a stake in rebuilding the great American middle class, creating ladders into it from the underclass, and restoring the reward for working hard and playing by the rules. If the rules have changed because of technology advancing, because of global competitors, then this nation has a moral obligation to help all Americans who are willing to work hard prosper under the new rules. If this society is to reverse the long-term decline in living standards of American workers, a far bolder strategy is necessary.
And that was former Labor Secretary Robert Reich back in 1994, delivering his famous speech on the American middle class, warning of the threat of a two-tiered society. Joining us now, editor-at-large at Newsweek, CNBC founder and contributor Tom Rogers, and opinion editor, also at Newsweek, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Tom's latest piece is titled A Masterclass in Not Treating the Working Class as Second Class, which highlights the new book released by Batya titled Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. Congrats on the book. So let's start right there. Just tell us a little bit about what you mean. What's the thesis here?
So I started to notice that despite the fact that we talk a lot about political polarization, if you look at the polling and if you talk to regular Americans, they are actually not very divided between left versus right. But there is a real class divide emerging in America between the multiracial, multi-ethnic working class and the college-credentialed elites. And I wanted to understand more deeply who is the American working class and do they still have a fair shot at the American dream. So I traveled the country and I interviewed many, many working class people from all races in many, many industries of all political persuasions. And what I found was astonishing. On politics and on policy, whether these working class people vote for Democrats or Republicans, they agreed by and large on all of the issues.
I've been nodding along vigorously, and we had a great conversation during the break about this because I just think about this all the time. And as I was relaying to you, I went to the Springsteen Archives Music Honors Award last week, and they honored one of the songwriters was John Mellencamp. You know, Pink Houses, Small Town, 30 years ago, sort of Secretary Rice 30 years ago talking about, particularly like globalization and not having, the United States, we didn't really react well to that. We didn't really compensate for the jobs that were lost. And I think Democrats are paying a big political price for that now. But, and Trump rallies, I talk to people, not a lot of difference between us on issues. It's about the respect, right? It's about, and in your book, do you talk about solutions or thinking about policies that would make a difference or even just attitudes, perhaps, that could make a difference as well?
Absolutely. So the first half of the book are deep, in-depth profiles of working class Americans from across the political spectrum, what issues matter to them, and what they need to help them access the American dream to get back into the middle class. The second half of the book is a series of totally nonpartisan, easily implementable solutions that would immediately improve the lives of working class Americans and give them back the dignity that the Democrats used to represent, the dignity of hard work.
So, Tom, what is the message here? President Biden, of course, came to office. He was a candidate in 2020. He seemed to represent sort of that middle working class more than a Democrat's national figure had in a while. But we're still seeing a slow erosion of that support. The more of them, whether it's just about a Donald Trump phenomenon or larger about moving to the Republican Party, how can Biden and his Democratic colleagues reverse that?
Well, I think that's a very key question for this election, because what is very clear to me from the masterclass that Batya gives in her book is that middle of the working class is totally focused on their personal economic situation. You really have to perceive what you need to do to break through and attract that middle working class based on that. And for the most part, Biden is in sync with an awful lot of their concerns. Health care comes through hugely in the book and very much becomes a Biden issue, one that the Republicans don't score on at all. But the one where Democrats and Biden really fall short is immigration. And it's not because what Batya reports that there's a kind of Trump racist view of immigrants polluting white culture. It's not that at all. They view immigration as real economic competition, undermining job opportunity, undermining wage growth. And there seems to be an incredible passivity perceived on their part in terms of Democrats addressing that. And the fact that the House blew up a bipartisan bill that would have gone to deal with a lot of this issue is a good talking point, but the talking point doesn't really seem to change perception. And I think there needs to be a much more muscular response coming out of the Biden administration that shows they're going to address this, even in the absence of legislation that should have passed.
But when I listen to you talk and see the book and then what Tom just said, isn't it also a challenge that we get past the things that they have divided the working class so that there's not a united approach to this? I remember when I was a kid, 13 years old, just joining Dr. King's chapter up in New York. He was trying to do a poor people's campaign. He was killed before he could get to Washington with it. 20 years later, one of my mentors, Jesse Jackson, at Rainbow Coalition, tried to do it. Isn't it part of the trick of those that kind of not deal with the working class is to pit people against each other? Well, blacks have your jobs, or immigrants have your jobs, or Latinos, or women, rather than our seeing a common need to come together against those that exploit and exclude all of us.
100%, Reverend. I'm so glad that you brought up Dr. King because I thought about him so much while writing this book. Dr. King appealed to the common humanity in all Americans, and by doing so, he was able to bring the nation along to a place that maybe we weren't at the time. And right now, what you have is a situation where the elites foment that division exactly like you say, Reverend, because they get a lot of power out of doing that, when the truth is that 70% of Americans who are working class, middle class, agree on the issues. They agree on immigration. We need a strong border. They agreed on health care. We need affordable, dignified health care. And the first party to get to that combination of strong immigration control, like the Democrats represented in the 90s, and expanded health care access is going to have a ruling majority, I believe.
I think the issue that immigration really highlights is, like protests regarding what's going on in Israel, like inflation, it is also a proxy for things seeming out of control and working class feeling as if there's just too much that isn't being dealt with, that suggests their lives aren't in the kind of control that they'd like to see. And not addressing immigration in a more muscular way, being passive on that issue, really contributes to that. And unfortunately, when people feel things are out of control, we know from history that's when authoritative figures saying, I can impose control, seem to have a bit of appeal that we wouldn't like to see. And so immigration in that sense is a real proxy issue for that.
Newsweek's Tom Rogers and Batya Ungar-Sargon, thank you both. Katty Kay, such an important conversation, one that really shapes today's politics.
Yeah, super important and super hard for the White House, it seems, to try and get its hands around Peter Baker. I mean, I was struck by one thing that the president said this week, which was actually about Japan and India, where he called them xenophobic countries for not allowing in more migrants. It sounds to me like the president, at least, is still thinking about immigration in terms of race and tolerance, and yet so many, according to Batya, so many Americans are thinking of this as an economic issue. Yeah, exactly. And of course, obviously, that was, as a foreign policy matter, not the smartest thing to say about it doesn't go down well with two very important allies. As we've seen repeatedly, Campaign Joe seems to keep making problems for foreign policy Joe. But I think you're right. He's trying to make the case for why America as a land of immigrants is a good thing, why we're different than a lot of other countries that aren't as open to immigration as we have historically been. But part of the case has to be made by that it's good economically, right? That in fact that we need immigrants in order to do jobs that frankly otherwise would be unfilled, in order to keep the economy moving, in order to keep the population growing. Right now we're having an issue with population beginning to taper off without the kind of influx of people that we've historically had. So I think that those are issues that he has to be able to try to explain to the American people too if he wants to get any progress on immigration. And by the way, there is plenty of evidence that in areas of the country where there are a lot of immigrants, whether they are legal immigrants or illegal immigrants, people who are here illegally, the economy seems to do better. So it is an argument that can be made. Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, thank you so much for keeping me company in the studio this morning.